3 days after I gave birth to my twin boys, my mother-in-law placed a $25 million check on my hospital bed and told me to give her my children. My husband stood right there, silent, and the woman he was cheating with was smiling like she already owned my life. So I signed the papers, and what I did next destroyed their entire empire. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old, a forensic accountant by profession. For more than a decade, I made a living finding financial lies hidden behind expensive smiles. Numbers tell stories. Most people never learn how to read them. I did. And that skill would eventually destroy one of the wealthiest families in the state. But that morning, I was simply a mother staring at 2 newborn boys. At least, that's what everyone believed. The door opened. First came my husband, Daniel. He avoided my eyes. That immediately told me something was wrong. Daniel was many things: weak, spoiled, easily influenced. But when he felt guilty, he could never look directly at me. Behind him came his mother, Margaret Ashford, the woman who controlled nearly everything. The family business, the family trust, the board members, the politicians who attended charity galas, even her own son. Margaret had the rare ability to make a room feel smaller simply by entering it. And behind Margaret came a young blonde woman carrying a designer handbag. I had never seen her before, yet somehow I already knew exactly who she was. The confirmation arrived when Daniel glanced at her, not at me, at her. The look lasted less than a second, but that was enough. Affair, confirmed. My stomach tightened, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. For months the numbers had been warning me: hotel charges, gift purchases, private apartment payments hidden through shell accounts. Daniel thought he was careful. He wasn't. Men rarely are. I had known another woman existed. I simply hadn't expected to meet her in my hospital room. Margaret sat down calmly. The blonde woman remained standing beside Daniel, like she already belonged there. "Emma," Margaret said. Her voice sounded unusually gentle. That worried me more than anger ever could. People like Margaret only become gentle when they want something valuable. I looked at my sons, then back at her. "What do you want?" A faint smile appeared. Straight to business. She appreciated that. The black folder landed on my hospital blanket. "Open it." I didn't move. She opened it herself. Inside were divorce papers, several financial documents, and one cashier's check. My breath caught. $25 million. For a moment, even I couldn't speak. Not because of the amount, because of what it represented. Margaret wasn't negotiating, she was purchasing. "You want a divorce?" I asked quietly. Daniel finally spoke. "It's for the best." The blonde woman slipped her hand into his. Neither seemed embarrassed, neither seemed ashamed. 3 days after I gave birth. Remarkable. Margaret tapped the check. "You'll receive the full amount immediately." Then she pointed to another document. "And you'll surrender custody of the boys." The room went silent. Even the air felt heavier. I looked at her, then at Daniel, then at the woman holding his hand. Nobody laughed, nobody corrected her. They were serious, completely serious. "You want my children." Margaret folded her hands. "I want my grandsons raised properly." The words landed harder than any slap. My sons weren't even a week old, and already she was talking as though I had failed them. I glanced down at the documents. Temporary guardianship, custody transfer agreements, trust beneficiary clauses, expensive legal language. But beneath all the polished wording was a very simple message: take the money, leave the babies, disappear. The funny thing was that Margaret thought she was the smartest person in the room. That was always her biggest weakness. I slowly lifted the custody papers. Read every page, every clause, every signature line, every technicality. Then I noticed something, a detail so important it changed everything. I kept my face expressionless. Years of auditing had taught me that. Never react when you discover the hidden number. Never let the other side know. Instead, I calmly looked up. "You prepared all this very quickly," Margaret smiled. "We've had time." Interesting, very interesting. That meant they had been planning this long before my sons were born, possibly before they were even conceived. Suddenly, dozens of strange events from the previous year began fitting together. The pressure to have children, Margaret's obsession with heirs, the trust documents, the board meetings, the family succession plans. This wasn't about grandchildren. This was about power, and power leaves fingerprints. I looked again at the papers, then at the check, then at my sleeping boys, and in that moment I made a decision, not an emotional decision, not a desperate decision, a mathematical one, the kind that changes everything. I reached for the pen. Daniel blinked. The blonde woman smiled. Margaret relaxed for the first time since entering the room. They thought they had won. I signed, every page, one after another, without hesitation, without argument, without tears. When I finished, I placed the pen down carefully. Margaret looked almost surprised. I expected more resistance. I smiled softly. So did I. Then I picked up my sons, both of them, one in each arm, and stood. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked. "Home," Margaret frowned. "The boys stay." I looked directly into her eyes. "No." For the first time all morning, uncertainty crossed her face, and that was when I knew. She hadn't understood the documents nearly as well as she thought she had. The moment I walked out of that hospital room carrying my sons, I felt every pair of eyes on me. Nurses smiled politely, unaware that a war had just begun on the 4th floor. My body still ached from childbirth, and exhaustion tugged at every muscle, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard Margaret's voice rise for the first time all morning. She was calling my name, demanding that I stop, demanding that someone do something. Nobody did, because nobody could. There was no court order. No judge had awarded custody. No legal authority had taken my children away. I was still their mother, and legally, that meant everything. I reached the hospital entrance where my closest friend, Rachel Morgan, waited in her SUV. Rachel had been my college roommate years ago before becoming a family attorney. More importantly, she was one of the few people I trusted completely. The moment she saw my face, she knew something had happened. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened the back door and helped secure the twins into their car seats. Minutes later, we were pulling away from the hospital while Margaret Ashford watched from a 4th-floor window, her perfect world beginning to crack. As we drove across town, I finally handed Rachel the folder. She read the documents while stopped at a red light. Then she read them again. By the time we reached the next intersection, she was laughing. "Emma," she said, shaking her head, "these people are idiots." I glanced at her. "That bad?" "It's worse. These papers are intimidation, not law. Half of this wouldn't survive 10 minutes in front of a judge." That confirmed what I had noticed in the hospital room. The documents looked impressive because they were designed to frighten me. They contained legal terminology, official-looking language, and enough paperwork to overwhelm someone exhausted from childbirth. But beneath the surface, they were weak. Very weak. Margaret had assumed fear would accomplish what law could not. She had underestimated me. Again. Instead of going home, Rachel drove us to a furnished townhouse 30 miles away. I had rented it quietly 6 weeks earlier after discovering unusual financial transfers connected to Daniel. At the time, I couldn't prove he was having an affair, but my instincts had been screaming that something was wrong. Experience had taught me never to ignore data. The townhouse wasn't luxurious. It wasn't even particularly nice. But it was safe. And right then, safe mattered more than anything else. That evening, while the twins slept nearby, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing years of financial records I'd copied from our home computer. What started as suspicion was rapidly becoming certainty. The Ashford family empire wasn't as stable as everyone believed. Their company, Ashford Healthcare Holdings, controlled nursing homes, insurance programs, assisted living facilities, and healthcare investments across multiple states. Publicly, the company appeared unstoppable. Financial magazines praised Margaret's leadership. Business networks interviewed her regularly. Investors treated her like royalty. But numbers don't care about reputation. And the numbers were telling a different story. Over the next 2 days, I barely slept. Whenever the twins rested, I worked. Account statements, annual reports, internal spreadsheets, board meeting summaries, investment records. Patterns emerged. Then more patterns, then something far bigger. By the 3rd night, I discovered an accounting discrepancy worth nearly $80 million. I stared at the screen, then checked the calculations again, Then a third time. Same result, 80 million. Hidden, moved between subsidiaries, disguised through valuation adjustments, technically legal if disclosed properly, potentially catastrophic if concealed. My pulse quickened. Margaret wasn't simply trying to take my children. She was protecting something. The question was what? The answer arrived sooner than expected. At 7:15 the next morning, my phone rang. Daniel. I let it ring 3 times before answering. His voice sounded exhausted. Emma, we need to talk. No, I replied. Please. Interesting. Daniel rarely said please, not unless he was scared. What happened? I asked. Silence, then a deep breath. My mother is furious. I almost laughed, only furious. That seemed optimistic. She wants the boys back. They aren't missing. You know what I mean. I did, but I enjoyed making him say it. They're my children, Daniel. They're my children too. The statement might have carried weight if he hadn't brought his mistress into my hospital room. Instead, it sounded pathetic. I heard another voice in the background, Margaret. Even over the phone, her presence felt unmistakable. Daniel lowered his voice. She's willing to increase the settlement. There it was. Money again, always money. Margaret believed every human being had a price because she'd spent her entire life surrounded by people who did. Board members, consultants, politicians, employees, everyone eventually sold something. What she couldn't understand was that some things simply weren't for sale. You should tell your mother something, I said calmly. What? The most expensive mistake she ever made wasn't writing the check. Daniel hesitated. Then what was it? Giving me time to look at her books. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then the line disconnected. I smiled, because now they knew not everything, but enough. Across town, panic was probably spreading through conference rooms and executive offices, and panic makes people sloppy. The following week confirmed it. Suddenly, old company contacts began reaching out. Former employees, retired executives, accountants who had quietly left the organization years earlier, people who had spent decades afraid of Margaret Ashford. Word was spreading, not publicly, not yet, but privately. People sensed weakness, and weakness attracts information. One former executive agreed to meet me at a small coffee shop outside the city. He arrived wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses despite cloudy weather. That alone told me how nervous he was. He sat across from me and slid a flash drive across the table. I should have reported it years ago, he said. My stomach tightened. Reported what? He looked around before answering. Everything. The flash drive contained thousands of internal emails, board communications, financial discussions, legal memos. Several mentioned deliberate efforts to conceal losses from investors. Others discussed manipulating valuations before audits. One email mentioned a strategy designed specifically to preserve control of the family trust through future heirs. My sons. Even before they were born, people had been discussing them as corporate assets. Not children, assets. That discovery made me physically sick, but it also gave me exactly what I needed. Proof. Real proof. The kind that destroys careers. The kind regulators care about. The kind shareholders sue over. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I allowed myself to believe I could actually win, not survive. Win. That evening, after putting the twins to bed, I stood beside their cribs and watched them sleep. They were so small, so innocent, completely unaware of the storm surrounding them. I promised them something quietly. No matter how powerful the Ashfords were, no matter how much money they spent, no matter how ugly the fight became, I would protect them, and I would make sure nobody ever treated them like property again. Across town, Margaret Ashford was preparing for war. The difference was that she still believed she was fighting a frightened young mother. She hadn't realized she was fighting a forensic accountant who now possessed evidence capable of collapsing an empire. And soon, the entire world would learn the difference. Across town, Margaret Ashford was discovering that lesson firsthand. The woman who once tried to buy my children was now spending millions trying to save herself. Unfortunately for her, the worst evidence still hadn't been released. And when it finally surfaced, losing money would become the least of her problems. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It cracks, then bends, then suddenly collapses under its own weight. For years, Margaret Ashford had controlled every room she entered. People stood when she arrived. Executives waited for her approval before making decisions. Investors treated her opinions like law. Now those same people were beginning to ask questions, and questions were dangerous, especially when honest answers didn't exist. 3 days after regulators announced their inquiry, Ashford Healthcare Holdings held an emergency board meeting. I wasn't there, but someone who was decided to call me afterward. His name was Thomas Reed, one of the independent board members. He sounded exhausted. "She's losing them," he said. I knew immediately who he meant. "How bad?" There was a long pause. "Worse than I've ever seen." According to Thomas, board members had spent most of the meeting demanding explanations. Why hadn't they been informed about the discrepancies? Why were regulators involved? Why had shareholders been exposed to unnecessary risk? Why had companies' stock lost hundreds of millions in value? Margaret had answers. But for the first time, people weren't accepting them. Fear was fading. And once fear disappears, loyalty usually follows. That evening, another executive resigned. The next morning, 2 more followed. Financial news channels began discussing a potential leadership crisis. Analysts downgraded the company's outlook. Major investors demanded independent audits. The pressure kept growing, and the walls kept closing in. Then Daniel showed up at my townhouse. Alone, no lawyers, no security, no expensive suit, just Daniel. For a moment, I barely recognized him. The confident executive I'd married looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot. His shoulders slumped. His entire posture screamed defeat. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. My sons were sleeping. They didn't need to hear this. Daniel stared at the ground. "Mom's in trouble." I almost laughed. That was certainly one way to describe it. "What do you want?" His voice cracked slightly. "I want this to stop." "There it is." He looked confused. "What?" "The first honest thing you've said in months." He winced. I continued. "You don't care about fixing anything. You care about stopping the consequences." Daniel rubbed his face. "You don't understand." "No," I replied calmly. "I understand perfectly." And I did. For the first time in his life, nobody was protecting him, not his mother. Not the company, not the family name, just reality, and reality can be brutal. Finally, he looked at me. "She'll lose everything." I held his gaze. "So will a lot of people who trusted her." That ended the conversation. Daniel left 10 minutes later looking even worse than when he arrived. And somehow I didn't feel sorry for him anymore. A week later, the breakthrough arrived. Not from regulators, not from journalists, from Walter Ashford. Or more specifically, from something he left behind. Rachel called me just after sunrise. "Get dressed." "What happened?" "I think we found the trust documents." My heart nearly stopped. The family trust had always been the center of everything. The heirs, the company, the obsession with my sons, everything traced back there. 2 hours later, we sat inside a law office reviewing documents recovered from an old estate archive. The deeper we read, the clearer it became. Margaret had lied. For years, to everyone, including her own son. Walter Ashford's trust contained a clause almost nobody knew existed. Control of the company could only remain within the family if future heirs were raised by their biological parent, unless a court determined that parent was unfit. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. Rachel smiled. "You see it too." I nodded slowly. The entire room suddenly felt lighter. Margaret's plan had never made sense emotionally. Now it didn't make sense legally either. If she took my sons away without cause, she risked violating the very trust she was trying to protect. Everything she'd done, the divorce, the custody scheme, the pressure campaign, the $25 million check, all of it had been based on a misunderstanding or arrogance, probably both. For years, she'd assumed nobody would challenge her interpretation. Now someone had, and the trust was about to become public. When news reached the board, panic exploded. Several members immediately demanded legal reviews. Others questioned whether Margaret's decisions had exposed the company to even greater liability. One investor called it catastrophic. Another called it fraud. Neither description seemed inaccurate. Then came the final blow. Federal investigators requested internal communications. Thousands of emails, financial records, board correspondence, everything. The company was legally required to cooperate, and once investigators gained access, the truth spread quickly. Hidden losses, misleading disclosures, internal warnings, ignored audits. The evidence wasn't ambiguous, it was overwhelming. Within a month, Margaret resigned. Officially, she cited personal reasons. Nobody believed that. The market didn't believe it. The media didn't believe it. The board certainly didn't believe it. Her resignation was simply the final acknowledgement of reality. The empire she spent decades controlling no longer belonged to her. The strange thing was that I didn't celebrate. I thought I would. I thought victory would feel larger, louder. Instead, it felt quiet, necessary, like balancing an equation that had been wrong for a very long time. A few weeks later, I received one final phone call. Margaret. Her voice sounded older, smaller. For the first time since I'd known her, she sounded human. "I never hated you," she said. I looked out the window toward the backyard where my sons rested in a stroller. "I know." The silence lingered. Then she asked the question she'd probably wanted answered from the beginning. "When did you start planning all this?" I thought about that. The answer surprised even me. "The day I realized you saw my children as assets instead of people." She didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. A few seconds later, the line went dead. And with it, the war finally ended. Margaret Ashford lost her position, lost control of the company, lost the influence she spent decades building. Daniel lost his marriage, his reputation, and the future he took for granted. As for me, I kept the only things that ever mattered: my sons, my freedom, and the certainty that no amount of money can buy what truly belongs to someone else. Because in the end, Margaret offered $25 million for my children. What she actually purchased was the downfall of her entire empire. 5 years passed in a way I never could have predicted when I walked out of that hospital room carrying 2 newborn boys and a future I had no name for yet. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. It became quieter, steadier, and in many ways stronger. My sons, Ethan and Lucas, grew into curious, bright children who filled every corner of my world with questions I sometimes struggled to answer. They never knew the full story of what happened before they were old enough to remember anything. Only that their mother worked in finance, and that we lived far away from the place where their last name once meant something to other people. I never returned to Ashford Healthcare Holdings, not even as a consultant, not even out of curiosity. The company went through restructuring, then a full takeover, then eventually disappeared into a different name entirely. To the outside world, it became a case study in corporate failure and regulatory correction. To me, it became something simpler, a closed chapter. Daniel tried to stay in my life for a while. At first, he sent messages asking to see the boys more often. Then came calls that sounded less confident each time. Eventually, they stopped altogether. I never encouraged hatred toward him and my children, but I never pretended he was something he wasn't. Time did the rest. Children are observant. They learn what presence means and what absence costs. Margaret Ashford faded from public view much faster than anyone expected. There were rumors about health issues, private settlements, and long legal restrictions that kept her out of corporate life permanently. Occasionally, I would hear her name mentioned in business circles, always followed by silence, as if people weren't sure whether it was still safe to talk about her. I never reached out. I never needed to. Some victories don't require witnesses. The only person I stayed in touch with consistently was Rachel. She became not just my lawyer, but family in a way titles could never properly describe. She watched my sons grow up, attended their birthdays, and never once asked for credit for what she helped me survive. Sometimes, late at night after the boys were asleep, I would sit by the window of our home and think about that hospital room. I remember how calm I looked when I signed those papers. People often assume that moment was courage or revenge. It wasn't either. It was clarity. I had simply understood that the person sitting across from me had underestimated me so completely that she had left me space to walk out and rebuild everything on my own terms. Money was never the real currency in that room. Control was, And Margaret believed control belonged to whoever held the checkbook. What she never understood was that some people don't measure survival in dollars. They measure it in decisions made under pressure, in silence when others expect panic, and in the ability to think clearly when everything is designed to make you emotional. My sons grew older and eventually began asking questions. Simple ones at first. Why we lived where we did. Why their father didn't visit. Why their grandmother never called. I answered honestly, but carefully, giving them truth in amounts they could carry without being burdened by it. They would learn everything someday, but only when they were ready to understand what power and consequence really mean. On their 10th birthday, I finally told them a version of the story. Not the full legal and financial details, but enough for them to understand the shape of it. I explained that sometimes adults make choices they believe are right, but forget to see the people involved. I told them that love is never something that can be bought or negotiated, no matter how confident someone sounds when they try. That night, after they fell asleep, Ethan left a small note on my desk. It simply said, "Thank you for choosing us." I kept it. Years later, I still have it. Because that is what everything came down to in the end. Not lawsuits, not empires, not headlines. Just a decision made in a hospital room by a woman who refused to treat her children as anything less than human. Margaret once tried to buy my sons for $25 million. But what she really proved was something far more important. Some things don't have a price. And once that truth enters a room, no amount of money can make it leave. What she didn't understand was that some things in life can't be bought with money. Not love, not motherhood, and not revenge. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe. Because here, every story has a secret, and every secret has a price.